that piece that my mother wrote originally and that you have graciously translated and updated. It's a great pleasure to be, by the way, at a joint meeting. We do believe in joint meetings in the Center for Peace and Conflict because we do believe in combining disciplines and creating synergies. And this is a joint meeting of the Political Science Department Symposium under the direction of Professor Yuan Sheng, who is here, and a number of political science students and faculty, and the Humanities Center's well-known and highly noted seminar series, which is really compelling across the whole campus. So it's a great honor to be having both. As you can see, this presentation will be a joint effort, is a joint effort of research that's been going on and that we're continuing to propose, recently sending in a NSF proposal to expand upon it. My partner in this, Professor Marie Olson-Lonsbury, Wayne State alumna, who teaches at East Carolina University, has collaborated with me on a number of studies of civil wars. And I'm happy to say that one of our prime student assistants in the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Gaia Klotz, is highly integral to the data and the interpretations that we've been able to make, and we'll hear from Gaia a little bit along the way here as well, I'm happy to say. The topic that we're looking at is international interventions and the consequences for insurgent strategies or behavior in civil wars. It may promise a little bit more than what we're able to deliver at the moment because this is kind of a preliminary study. What we aim to do, though, is try to deconstruct some of the research that's been published in the field, examining the impacts of intervention. And I've studied intervention practically my whole career, the intervention in international intervention across boundaries and across borders by one country with troops in another country or forces in another country. Some of the things that have come out of that, of course, is that interventions in civil wars have, in a sense, made the wars generally worse. We find that levels of violence tend to go up, that in some respects, at some points, negotiations are retarded or do not take place, perhaps because of the extended capabilities that are afforded to one side or the other in a civil war by outside interveners. One can only think, for instance, of the Vietnam War or other civil wars that have classically lasted a long time. Other civil wars, of course, last a long time too. Sri Lanka, where there were periodic interventions that didn't do a whole lot of good either, but the wars pretty much on their own momentum and with funding from abroad tended to be long and bloody and frustrating, with sometimes periods of negotiation and then sometimes breaking of those negotiations or those agreements, and in the case of Sri Lanka, ending in a one-sided final victory, at least over the forces of rebellion after a decade or more. So this pattern, plus the more recent disturbances that seem to have at least caught the attention of the American decision makers, particularly in Libya, where the NATO intervention and the dethronement or overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi released a whole plethora of unanticipated consequences and worsening of violence, which I think was picked up on finally and has affected the decision making in Washington as to how deeply and how quickly to become involved in any further civil war, let's say the Syrian civil war, which is part of our study here, as you'll note. So this caught our attention, and we'd like to know more because the findings to date have been rather broad brush, intervention and either escalation or de-escalation of fighting, of the wars. But we don't know much about the pattern which has come to play in more recent times, where we're aware that there are rebel groups and there are other rebel groups, and there are dispersions and what you might call splintering of groups, and then reformation of groups and renaming of groups and so on and so forth. We don't know a whole lot yet about whether that's affected by or product in any sense of outside forces that intervene. And intervention itself, of course, is a broad category. What we've studied, and mostly in the past, is military force intervention. But there are lots of other ways that countries intervene, diplomatically, to back one side or another, economically, to supply aid, sending arms as opposed to sending troops or planes, bombing. So there are various forms of intervention. Most of the studies don't pick that up very carefully. So in a sense, we also noted something else. It may be that there's a two-way street that goes on. That intervention may lead to violence, more violence in the country or less, or violence in the country may lead to the interventions. There is a notion that I've seen, for a long time, that major powers tend to intervene in a country when they seem to be about to lose their clients in that country. The U.S. got very deep into Vietnam when it appeared that the government there was subject to being overthrown rather soon under the Diem regime. And the Soviet Union got deeply entrenched in Afghanistan when it appeared that the Mujahideen, so-called, were about to overthrow the Soviet-favored client regime in Kabul back in the end of the 1970s. So the loss of control appears to be one triggering factor for outside interveners. Outside interveners, may have a number of motives. The concern about regional destabilization may be another. That the spread of a civil war across lines and destabilization, as we've seen, of course, in the ISIS effects in both Iraq and Syria, may so alarm regional states and major powers that they do more by way of trying to stem the war or tilt it in a certain direction. And as I say, the loss of a favored government or the impending loss of a favored government, or more recently, of course, so-called concern about human rights. I don't know how deeply that's really motivating, but when there is the potential use of chemical weapons or the potential use of widespread killing, genocidal killing, it may lead to efforts from abroad. And of course, intergovernmental organizations get involved this way too. So it seems like there would be a complex interrelationship where external intervention may lead to effects on violence in a country, but violence in a country and its implications may lead to or draw in external intervention. That two-way street has not been studied much. And that's one of the things we tried to do in this study, to try to figure out a way to do that. So what we've done, and one other thing theoretically, it's been pointed out to us, there's a sort of a moral hazard potential in these complex relationships where insurgents may see that intervention can be drawn in and therefore make moves to make it more likely that intervention will oppose a government by sort of provoking the government into overreactions. We don't know if that happens, although we see there's a potential for that. That the sense that you can stimulate overreaction and atrocity, which will then make it more and more necessary by the international actors to try to do something about the situation. So there's lots of potential here for motivational study, which is not always easy. So what we've done is we've come up with a couple of hypotheses at the simple sort of basic level, because we do both here an aggregate data study of conflicts across the world to see if we can pick up trends in statistical terms. And thanks to Gaia, we also have a case study in some depth about the Syrian case, which we want to present to you as well, to try to create a timeline of events to show that in the Syrian case, interventions tend to occur at certain points in the war. Violence by one side or the other tends to pick up or decline at certain points of the war. And essentially, are there any ways to relate these together and make some sort of sense of the possible two-way causations that are going on. So first, in the global sense, and my friend Dr. Roth and his views of aggregate data points out, of course, that we often have to simplify our questions down to measurable levels, and therefore may or may not get to the crux of what's most interesting, but at least we take an initial look at what appears to be happening on a certain dimension. And in this case, one of the things we can measure, or at least others have measured in some studies that we want to use here for the data purposes, particularly a study by Wood and Kathman and Gent, Wood, Kathman, and Gent, who studied the effect of outside interventions on the subsequent levels of violence in the country. And so they have some data that we can make use of in this sense, but they didn't study it both ways. They didn't study the opposite, potential that the thing goes the other way around. And they also use data which are somewhat limiting in the number of cases that can be measured. So we will try to do something about that. So, but anyway, the basic hypotheses, just for initial study, is that as one-sided violence against civilians by governments increase, so they can measure in each year, country year, or conflict year, the aggregate level of attacks on civilian populations by governments. As that increases, as there is, like the Gaddafi situation was thought to be about to happen, that's the excuse that the US and the NATO forces used to intervene, that he was about to attack his own population in a major way. The occurrence of hostile anti-government foreign military intervention becomes more likely. So can we find statistical association between those acts of violence by governments and outside interventions against government? Secondly, and almost as a corollary, one-sided violence by the governments will increase in the presence of hostile foreign military intervention. That is, for starters. We think that there's some theoretical basis that one might predict that the government will get more repressive as the rebels get more backing. Turning it around, looking at rebel group behavior in foreign military intervention, the third hypothesis, as one-sided violence by rebels targets civilians in a greater and greater way, or increases, the occurrence of government-supported military intervention will be more likely. That is, outsiders will come to the rescue of a government where the rebels are violating principles of, which I don't know what we could call human rights, but excessive violence that targets civilians. And the government will get more backing. On the other hand, also, one-sided violence by rebels will purportedly increase if there is government-supported intervention going on. That is the opposite side of that coin. Now, we're fully willing to take the opposite potential, that violence may decrease in these cases, but we expect to find some relationship between the external interventions and the violence levels. Here is how the method, how the theory sort of breaks down with other, with the various factors we suppose will affect this. And by the way, there's a handout that we have that lists these charts for your greater reading pleasure or study here. And these are control variables or external third variables that have been thought to be important, particularly in the Wood studies, that can cause these kinds of acts of violence. So government one-sided violence and hostile intervention, the violence leading to the intervention, or in Model 2, the intervention leading to the violence, are affected by such things as conflict intensity, how much actual fighting is going on, conflict area, how much of the spread of the country is being affected, conflict age, how long has the conflict been going on, is longer civil war or not, number of rebel groups, that is, you know, the more the groups, there are 1,000 groups in Syria, not all of them necessarily fighting, but there were 1,000 opposition groups at one point to the Syrian government. Does that matter in leading to more violence or affecting intervention? Also, what type of regime is it? Is it a single-party repressive regime? How does it score on the polity scores? The GDP of the country, does that matter if it's a more economically advanced or not country? Population size, excuse me, and then we look at the effect of the lagged variables on the subsequent activity. So we have 1 year lagging of the variables. So we can go over some of that, but that is the way we set up models to look at either violence by the rebels or violence by the governments. So if I might turn it just briefly over to Gaia to talk about the methods we use to look at the Syrian civil war. I think is that next? No, that's, before we get to the findings, you want to say something about the methods?
Sure. So I want to take this time to just thank Dr. Pearson for allowing me to participate in this study. It's been a great honor to be able to work with someone and learn so much about this field. So my specific area that I focused on was the Syrian developments, so I was focusing on the Syrian case study. And in order to develop data for the Syrian case study, I created a timeline, and this was based on a specific outline that was provided by the Stanford University's Mapping Militant Organizations project initially. And it ended up looking something like this. And I'll go into a bit more detail about what exactly I have on that a little bit later. But as you can see, I created a timeline that compiled around 52 different articles from different organizations. I had several news organizations, including the Associated Press and PR, as well as different research organizations, including the Institute for the Study of War. And I selected these specific articles, which of course were all in English, so therefore my research was a little bit limited because I was not able to get the first-hand research from the Arabic sources. However, I was able to track specific interventions that had to do with military interventions internationally or within the Syrian area, supplies, funding, sanctions, and diplomatic initiatives. I ended up selecting these specific articles on their ability to be cross-referenced, their significance, which I defined really briefly as meaning that the instance which was reported could trigger an action or a response from either rebels, the government, or an international actor. And then finally, I also selected it based on the fact that the specific articles concerned actors that were relevant to the research that was being conducted. So again, these concerned the main areas of, as you can read there, the government forces, the counter-government forces, as well as international actors. And that was my methodology for that specific section. I'll turn it over to you again.
Okay, so I'll just report the quantitative findings that we did come up with, but I want to mention the way we set these models up to do that. So one of the things, and this is complicated methodologically because sometimes the number of cases is not sufficient, or we don't think it can be a greater number of cases because data are lacking. For instance, the data in the Wood study that shows the level of troops that interveners devote to the intervention. He does a ratio of the troops going toward the government side or the troops going toward the rebel side in a given year. Well, that can be kind of tricky to actually taken from news sources and public sources as to actually how many troops are there. So there are some missing data cases that reduce the numbers involved from 1,100 cases initially of the conflict years to something like 600. But we sort of try to get around that by doing a second measurement of intervention using data that I had developed with some partners over the years called the International Military Intervention Data at University of Kansas. Kansas State. You would not like my confusing that. Kansas State. Jeff Pickering. There we look simply at whether there was hostile intervention or friendly intervention pro-government, anti-government in a given year without trying to do a ratio of the number of troops so that we can boost the end. Also, some of the violent behavior activities by groups lack data. Even though we added cases, we didn't get as high as 1,100 because there were missing data. So one of the things we wanted to see is, do we need a simultaneous equation model that would have both the interventions leading to violence and violence leading to interventions in the same equation, in the same model? In other words, do you have to do a simultaneous equation to measure them both at the same time, or can you take them separately? And the way that Marie has suggested of doing that, which is interesting, is to take a test of the statistical significance of the Wald test for rho in a simultaneous equation model. And if this is not significant, then there is no need to keep them together in a single equation. You can do separate analysis. And indeed, this level of chi-square, this level in the first report here, which you're reporting on government violence, on one-sided government violence leading to intervention against the government, was not significant. So we then partitioned the study into two separate models, or model 1A and 1B, using the Wood data on one and the IMI measurement on the other, to see if and to replicate in a way Wood's study, which did look at this. So one-sided government violence, in this sense, as related to the ratio of interventions pro the government or anti-government, and by the way, that is, if it's a positive coefficient, it's anti-government. If it's a negative coefficient, it's pro-government. Is significant at above the 0.05, at below the 0.10 level anyway, and it does seem to show that one-sided government violence leads to anti-government intervention, or is correlated with anti-government intervention. The other significant factor here appears to be the conflict area involved. The greater the area, the less, the more pro-government the intervention may be. The greater the area, the more pro-government the intervention may be. So that's interesting, and it replicates Wood's finding. But when we use our data, which was hostile versus simply hostile versus friendly intervention that's related to the government, that relationship bombs out. It doesn't reach significance. There is no particular relationship between one-sided government violence and external intervention in that sense against the government. And here the key factor that appears to be, factors that appear to be significant are rebel capability, intensity of fighting, and conflict area. These seem to lead to anti-government intervention. So, in a sense, hypothesis one is not supported by our data. And by the way, our data only deal with sending at least 1,000 troops, a large-scale intervention. So we don't know whether it's the large-scale interventions that don't seem to relate to the government violence or not, as opposed to smaller scale. We want to study that in the future. The second table looks at question of one-sided government violence when there's an intervention, when there's an anti-government intervention. Does that sort of lead to significant findings? For Wood, it does at the 0.02 significance level, and that again replicates his findings that in this sense it's pro-government intervention leading to one-sided government violence. On the other hand, in our study, and here again, in our study, it is also significant. But the, let's see, get this correct. This is table 3. The sign is positive in table 3 in our in the Wood study, and the sign is negative in our study. What this means is that, for us anyway, hostile behavior by the government tends to go down when there's an intervention on behalf of rebels. For some reason, the government large-scale intervention. For some reason, the government seems to pull back and not have such abuses at that point when outsiders are aiding the rebels. It may be that there's a dampening effect. It may be that the government is forced to confront negotiation possibilities at that point. It may be that there's a dampening effect. For the Wood study, on the other hand, it's a positive coefficient, and so it appears that the government is more likely to initiate violence when the intervention is favoring rebels. So, and that's at all kinds of levels of intervention in his study, at least at 25 a level of troops. So, not 1,000 level of troops. So we have conflicting findings here, which is interesting. We don't know quite how to explain it, but we will be working on that. We looked then at rebel violence in tables 4, 5, and 6, and we find again that the let's get to table 4. In this case, the simultaneous equations are significant. Sorry, I did something. The simultaneous equations are at a significance level, so we have to stick with them to a certain extent. We have to examine this in one equation, simultaneous model, rather than separately, in separate models. So we look at this and we find that using our data set, we don't seem to see much relationship between rebel violence and pro-government intervention. And we don't seem to see supportive government intervention relating much to the level of rebel violence the other way. So hypotheses 3 and 4, at least hypothesis 3, does not seem to be substantiated in the measurements that we're finding there. If we look further in separate analyses dealing with hypothesis 4, and hypothesis 4 is, again, I'd like to recall it, one-sided violence by rebels will increase in the presence of supportive aiding the government intervention. So we're looking at the rebel violence as the dependent variable. We do find a bit of confirmation in that in a significant level there with Wood and a not significant level with us in the IMI data. So again, Wood seems to find confirmation that rebel violence will increase when the governments are being backed by outside interveners. We don't. And so we need to explore further why those discrepancies might exist. So one way of looking at this is to expand the types of intervention we're looking at and see what else is going on, and to get more into the depth and detail of a specific set of cases. We want to eventually do that across a broad number of cases, but right now we only have the data for Syria. So let me turn it to Gaia to try to say what Syria seems to show us.
Okay, so here we go. As we're all relatively familiar with what's happening in Syria, and I'm just going to provide some brief statistics that I received from The Guardian. Guardian's Ian Black on Wednesday, the 10th of February in 2016, just so that we have a common base from which to move forward with regards to this specific case study. So in The Guardian's article, Ian Black reports that the Syrian Center for Policy Research indicates that 11.5% of Syria's population has been killed or injured since 2011. The number wounded in the country is 1.9 million. The economic loss as of 2016 is 175 billion euros, and 45% of the population has been displaced. This equals about 6.36 million internally inside of the country and 4 million abroad. So this is an extremely important case study for us to look at specifically right now. All of you have packets, which I handed out. Well, not everyone, I'm sorry. I made 10, and I only have 7, and those of you that have them, feel free to reference it. But before I delve into the case study, I wanted to provide a brief background about key designated terrorist organizations that I'll be touching on within my timeline, as well as some primary opposition umbrella organizations and opposition forces. So first, we can see that on this list I have Al-Qaeda, and I have in parentheses, these are the dates that the US State Department designated these specific groups to be terrorist organizations. So as we can see, Al-Qaeda, 1999, that's the oldest designated terrorist organization. And from this specific Al-Qaeda in Iraq sprung al-Nusra, and we also have the Islamic State or Daesh. And I have all of these different listings of different names that it's been referred to and changed throughout time. And again, it has more background in that packet, so if you want to confer with someone next to you with that packet, you'll be able to learn more about that background information if you need that. Second, this is just some background about the primary opposition umbrella organizations, and this information I took from the Carter Center's country reports. And this is significant because, as Dr. Pearson mentioned beforehand, the organization of rebel groups within Syria and within these specific case studies is extremely complex. So in order to have an accurate analysis of what exactly is going on with these rebel groups, it's critical that we have a more in-depth understanding of them. And if I may, I'm just going to read a little section from this pamphlet that I handed out that I think is significant to describe the complexities with regards to these organizations. The specific Carter Center report of 2014 indicates that as the conflict has progressed, many of these collaborations that we saw, like for example here it mentions the Free Syrian Army, but that it's not truly existed, that many of these collaborations have fallen apart almost as quickly as they were formed. Nearly every group formed in the first year of the conflict has joined with and subsequently broken ties with every other group in the area. Towards the end of 2013, however, so that's what we have there. That's really significant for us to understand going forward, that it's very complex. So here are a few of the large umbrella organizations that I'll be pointing to when I reference specific groups within my timeline. And here is just a map of Syria so that we can orient ourselves when I talk about the conflict. We can see that within we have a river within the northeastern section, and then we have a mountainous area closer to within Homs, which is extremely significant for rebel forces as well. And this is the basis for which I decided to create my timeline off of, which is the Stanford University's Mapping Militant Organizations project. As you can see, it has a list of all of these different organizations. We have some of the organizations that I mentioned within the key significant terrorist organizations, including the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, Hezbollah, and here we see that if it's allied, we see a blue dotted line drawing these alliances here. However, these same groups, we can see later on, end up becoming rivals with specific events as well. So within my timeline, I made sure to demarcate when these changes occurred. We also see that here are the umbrella organizations, which are described further in the packet, as well as splits. We can see when those happen between specific organizations, and mergers, which is in black, and affiliates in blue. So I used all of this information to compile a timeline, and my timeline covered the area of 2011 until 2015 in December. So in order to describe exactly what it is that I did in my timeline, which is just a collection of qualitative data from several different news sources, and we can see that I created different sections that signified, based on color, significant mergers or collaborations between opposition groups. I highlighted those in blue. Significant splits within opposition groups, I highlighted those in a light red color. Significant international interventions in the form of troops, arms, aid, and diplomacy. I made those in bold, black, and white. Right here, you can see an example of that. And significant action by the Syrian government. This I put in yellow. So if I apply this to the most recent developments within the conflict, for example, in December 2015, we can see that here in 2015, in order to highlight the dates, I changed the color, but I see that in January, Kurdish forces pushed ISIS out of Kobani on the Turkish border. In March, the opposition forces back the government, and as we continue throughout, we can see that in September, this is a significant international intervention with Russia beginning to transport housing units for Syrian airfield and making delivery of their portable air traffic control station, and then Russia begins its airstrikes in Syria, and as we end here in December, we can see Britain joins the international coalition that begins bombings, and finally, also in December with actions against the Syrian government, we can see that the Syrian army allows rebels to evacuate the remaining area of homes, which is something that the Syrian army has been fighting to regain for several years. And here in November, there's also a significant interaction between the Syrian government as well as rebel forces when Bashar al-Assad's Syrian Arab army, with the support of the Russian air forces, ends up being able to gain an air base in East Aleppo, and which defeats the Islamic State and ends up regaining that territory for them. So in order to kind of summarize exactly what happened within all of these findings, I decided to create graphs in order to kind of demarcate when specific events occurred and what reactions happened following those events. So as you can see, here's my timeline here, and this red demarcates government action, the blue is international interventions, and the green is rebel or opposition action, and that includes mergers as well as splits. So when we look at this, as I divided it into the different sections because I have a different number of events that occurred each year. So for example, in 2011, some significant actions that occurred within international interventions were there were sanctions that were imposed on Syria by the EU and the United States. So we can see that spike in international interventions right here. And then we can also see that there was a great acceleration of the formation of rebel groups. So we can see that in green right here as well. So we can also see in reaction to these sanctions that the government action ended up dropping down right here. So as I look at this timeline, we're able to see how different actions by both the government as well as the international community ended up eliciting possibly, there's not a necessarily a direct, there's correlation, but it may not be causation between these several points of analysis here. And then another point that's extremely important to point out is this point right here, and this is in 2013, and this is when the chemical weapons controversy came to a head. And we see the international community coming together and trying to get the chemical weapons out of Syria. We also see different actions within the United Nations trying to make sure that happens. And then in reaction to this, we see government actions go down significantly. However, throughout the course of the following years, there are also small reports of the use of chemical weapons as well. So yes, I think that this is important for the general findings, and I don't know, Dr. Pearson, would you like to add anything?
Well, I heard a report on the news this morning from a guy who purports to be Donald Trump's foreign policy advisor, one of his foreign policy advisors, who is evidently a journalist. And they were interviewing him about the Syrian situation, and it's one of the things that he was asked about would candidate Trump do anything really differently than the Obama administration has done? And he said yes, they would, because they would call upon the regional actors, the Arab states, to conduct ground operations in a major way against ISIS and the extremists in Syria. And they would get Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and some of the other Sunni-based countries to do the major part of the fighting with heavy American air support. Well, it just made me wonder, you know, in this kind of situation with these kinds of ramifications, do they have any sense at all of what such an intervention would do? And do they have any historical understanding of the positions of countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt with regard to the Assad regime and what their main interests are in Syria? Is their main interest actually destroying ISIS? Well, maybe, but one cannot preclude their other interests. And by the way, at the end of this, we're going to have foster negotiations out of that. As we know, there are currently hesitant negotiations going on that the Russians and the Americans have helped foster. With the Russian intervention here, I guess 2015 is here, right? Yeah. The Russian intervention there at the end is blue, and the government behavior is higher. As is the rebel behavior to a certain degree. And by the way, these are general, we're not just talking about attacks on civilians, we're talking about all kinds of behavior, offensives and, attacks, or these are politically motivated strategic behaviors. It has increased everything in a way after the Russians got in. So in a sense, we're finding that intervention has made a difference there, potentially, perhaps, leading to some actual move toward peace talks. But now the Russians are pulling back, we read, not wanting to get too engaged or too stuck, so to speak, as Obama predicted they might, and really simply get the momentum started without having to be stuck with Assad for the permanent future, because they too seem to want to have elections at some point, transitional elections, to solve this matter in a certain way and create some stability. So one doesn't know what the subsequent effect will be, but at least some of the organizations are now willing to negotiate. But ISIS, of course, is not included in that. So the question is, would the Donald Trump advisor approach do better at fostering negotiations by getting more Arab states to commit more troops into the country on the ground, if they can indeed can be convinced to do so? And indeed, Egypt is a major kind of military potential actor, but are their motives mixed in dealing in Syria? And would the American administration of that sort have any inkling as to these nuances? We certainly didn't in Iraq when we engaged in massive intervention in Iraq. And we probably didn't in Libya sufficiently either. So would the level of care and concern and detail in terms of the pattern of behavior, where you see sometimes intervention is preceded by violence and is led by the violence, and sometimes intervention results in the violence or is followed by the violence, would any care and caution be duly available in that? That's one of the things we'd like to encourage, but I'm not sure that we would have much confidence. So at this point, we could open for further discussion, but that's, we sort of confirmed what the Wood findings were, but they are not confirmed by and large with our data sets. So we still don't know a whole lot about the global pattern. Yes?
First a question and then a general comment. The question is, do we have any reason to believe that Uncle Sam's government has not been trying to negotiate with the neighboring countries to do what Mr. Trump's advisors have advised us to do? I mean, all these negotiations would be quiet anyhow.
Most of the involvement of Saudis and Gulf states have been for supplies. We don't have, the Saudis, where they have undertaken direct intervention, is Yemen and Bahrain.
Do we know that we haven't tried to persuade them to do otherwise?
I don't know, but I would suspect that we probably haven't really encouraged a lot of troops on the ground by outside parties. It's been mostly air support. Those states have committed air forces. Saudis have bombed, the Jordanians have bombed, and that's why, by the way, the Jordanians suffered terrorist retribution at the hands of ISIS. And NATO has suffered terrorist retribution for their air campaign. But most states have avoided direct military on-the-ground involvement in the fighting, relying on so-called support of, arms to rebels, more or less. Saudis more, Americans somewhat restrained, but then at some point increasingly allowing.
And just a general comment, I assume that you want to generalize this beyond Syria. And then my question is, what is your definition of civil war? Because you mentioned Vietnam, and a good argument could be made that Vietnam is not a civil war. I mean, if you're going to make Vietnam a civil war, then Korea is also a civil war. And where do we stop?
Well, I happen to believe that they were also civil, that they were internationalized civil wars. These are called internationalized civil wars. There is a significant level of intrastate violence, competition for power. Usually in the data definitions of the COW project, the Correlates of War project, they have a civil war category which has organized military units fighting governments with at least 1,000 battle deaths. So that there is a cutoff of violence that has to be exceeded and organized units of fighters. And that was present in a sense, if you consider Korea one country, which many wouldn't, but in Vietnam as well there was localized insurgency, even within the South. So even if you count Vietnam as the southern Vietnam, there was an insurgency of the Viet Cong. So that would be more likely to be more easily delineated as a civil war. But that's our general sense of civil war in this case. And various studies have a bit of different nuance about it. Is it 25 battle deaths? Is it 1,000? But I think the general line is that there have to be organized fighters on both sides of the government and the opposition. Of course, in the Syrian case, we note that the fighters are fighting each other too. I mean, the rebel groups are fighting, non-state actors are fighting each other in Syria as well. When you count the Kurdish battalions fighting ISIS, when you count the Hezbollah fighting some of the Sunni ISIS type or Al-Qaeda type groups, a lot of the fighting is not directly with the government troops themselves, but either government allies or government opponents, but group fighting group. In some of our analyses, we're able to pick that up in what Gaia has come up with. In the data of the quantitative data, we only use government and rebel fighting.
Based off of the scope of your hypothesis and that with future implications, have you looked at collaborating with other institutions in these areas where these issues are occurring and comparing the data, because the hypothesis in looking at this will constantly change. So in order to get the historical, that's going to be ongoing. So are you looking at collaborations in specific areas based off of?
These specific geographical areas?
Yes, specific geographical areas.
Not so much.
training.
We're collaborating with our colleagues at Kansas State and East Carolina to propose to be able to collect data like Gaia has done on more and more cases, and to be able to compare the cases to see patterns in a better way. But it's an interesting point to try to figure out, should there be collaboration with institutions, let's say in the region, that are also studying these questions. We can look into that. I haven't really done so much. Yes?
I have a couple of questions. The first one, with your study heavily dependent on Eurocentric studies, if you will, or American studies, if you will, what are you doing to avoid falling into the definitional problem? For example, and the reason why I'm asking this is because I'm looking at the variables here, and you're talking about terrorist groups one terrorist group can be somebody else's freedom fighter. They, Nelson Mandela was just removed from the terrorist list, a few years ago. So how are you taking that into consideration when you're doing that study, making sure that you are not making the mistake of not fully understanding the Middle Eastern nature of the conflict? That's the first question. The second question I have also relates to the variables too as well. It seems to me that central to your hypothesis would be the regional powers in terms of interest and in terms of involvement in the area. How is this accounted for in the variables? Because if you're not taking in consideration international interests, I mean, there's no way that you can make it, in my humble opinion, there's no way you can make a valid correlation.
Okay, we're almost saying the same thing, asking the same questions.
To address some of the concerns about Western perspective, I think that that's a very, very valid question. And I think that specifically with regards to my data collection, I recognize that lots of my sources are based in the West. I did a great deal of research trying to reach out to objective centers to gain their analysis and deeper perspective so that they would be able to create, they are the ones who go out and, for example, the Carter Center is an organization that collaborates information that's published on YouTube in Arabic as well as English. And so
But it's the Carter Center.
yeah, so I wanted to make sure that I got information from those sites and those sources that aren't just from one perspective. And then second, to address the issue of forming within the analysis, kind of delineating between terrorist, quote-unquote, organizations that are demarcated by the United States as terrorist organizations and those that are rebel forces. When I marked it, when I say opposition groups, I just mean in general opposition groups to the Assad government. So that encompasses ISIS, that encompasses as well as the Syrian Revolutionaries Front. So those two groups are encompassed, and the only thing that I differentiated between the two of them was whether they merged together or whether they split or had.
The term terrorist comes into our analysis really only as a reaction to others' data sets, which have sometimes been confined to so-called terrorist groups. We intentionally expanded to any and all opposition groups that are militarily active. And so terrorist is not something that we really want to use as a label in this case, because that picture at the very beginning of the front page where there's this scene of wreckage from the air, that's, I think, due to Syrian bombing of that historic site in Aleppo. So there's state terrorism, obviously, that occurs. So I don't think that label does us too much good in terms of trying to figure out the effect on insurgent group activity, which is really what we're after. But it's a very good point. Now, I think the guy, didn't you look also at Al Jazeera as source material or some other?
I did.
English language, but Middle Eastern based. There are some sources. So,
But
yeah.
Al Jazeera is also being accused of being highly aligned with,
Right.
Qatar, U.S., Saudi Arabia, which are in the same regional interest as.
But not always agreeing with Saudis on every point.
True.
Interesting, too.
I just was wondering
still
where
on
is the in terms of the variables, how did you account for that international interest in terms of deciding whether to be or not to be involved?
And it might, as you point out very interestingly, it might make a good sense to distinguish between regional interveners and global interveners.
Exactly.
Because regional interveners are very active in this case, obviously, with Turkey, Iran, particularly Saudis in a different way, but certainly very active. Their concerns. What we have playing out there is a Cold War regionally between Iran and Saudi Arabia to invite Saudi Arabia into this country, where Iran's presence is already there, without knowing what you're doing, can indeed inflame a whole regional thing, make it worse. So, you know, it's probably good as we have some students looking at regional hegemons, regional powers and their behavior as to how that may be distinguished from global actors like Russia and the United States and NATO who come into these things from quite different perspectives.
If I may, going forward, it might be, that's a really good suggestion, it might be smart to divide international interventions between regional interventions as well as those interventions that are further away. So thank you.
I have a little bit of concern with the research design because, as I understand it, your observations are all Civil War observations, and it seems to me that the decision by rebel groups to initiate a civil war is often going to be predicated on their expectations about the prospects for foreign support, and so I think Syria might be an interesting example of that, because I think at some point the rebel groups probably expected the United States to come in and play a much bigger role
They did.
than we did. And to a certain extent, I think those expectations before the war, I don't know, I feel like you might need a selection model because the universe of cases you're studying is kind of a biased universe of cases.
You mean that are already broken out into civil war, right?
Well,
Is that what you mean? And look at the ones that haven't broken out, didn't break out?
right. Like, and so like there's, I guess, a Heckman selection model would have like all of the countries. You can pale data of all countries or all developing countries or whatever you divide the sample. Choose a sample, and then and so the model would be: is there a civil war or not? And then within the set of cases where there is a civil war, do you have?
And can we find the same patterns in cases that weren't civil wars? Is that what you're saying? Where you have the potential, but it didn't become a civil war because groups didn't get the anticipated support, or because some other thing happened? Is that the reason why we would want to look at the other side of that coin? Yeah, you're right. We will. Well, thank you all for coming, and if you got any further suggestions, I'll be happy to hear them. Take a look at the packet and see what you think.